Up next on Book TV, Francis Fukuyama explores the origins of government, from the development of tribal societies to the rise of politics in Europe.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is clearly a standing room only audience, and I know that we're eager to get into this and have lots of discussion, because we're here to celebrate the publication of Francis Fukuyama's major contribution, The Origins of Political Order from Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. Before we begin, I want to just say that this is a momentous time for politics and prose. As you know, I'm David Cohen, who's Carla Cohen's husband, and she and Barbara Mead, together with the stellar staff here at Politics and Prose, and you, the very engaged and articulate lovers of books and ideas, and the community of writers, publishers, editors, agents, have made Politics and Prose into more than a bricks-and-mortar bookstore. It is a thriving community institution. It is a setting for the discussion and dissemination of ideas, and it's a hallowed public space where people meet, talk, disagree, discuss, and do it in a civil way. And it will continue that way under the leadership of its new owners, Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine. So I just want to, continuity will stand, and appropriate changes will be made too, but not around what's a community institution, around ideas and around public space. I very much wanted to introduce Francis Fukuyama tonight because I respect him, even though, as I told him, I taught civil society activists in Asia and Africa work on civil society, and we had a lot of vigorous discussion about the end of history 10, 15 years ago. And so that's one reason. But the more important reason is he is an open-minded scholar who embraces big ideas, who's not encapsulated by silos or artificial boundaries. He clarifies as he pursues nuance and complexity. Don't be fooled by the fact that this book, after the colon, says from prehistoric times to the French Revolution. Professor Fukuyama takes us through the relationships of the state, law, and accountable government. And he wants to know what is the origin of state, law, and accountable government. And having one of those in place doesn't presuppose that the others will have vibrant and alive institutions. He discusses failed and failing states in his writings, provides probing questions about the United States as well. I love the fact that you defend the necessity of politics, even as you take us through political anxiety, political decay, and it makes us think about our own society here in the United States. I have not read the whole book yet, but I've already been made to think. For me, an unreconstructed, and I would like to think an open-minded liberal, you've helped me realize there's more to Friedrich Hayek than market absolutism. So let us welcome Francis Fukuyama. And let's also pay tribute to the good work of C-SPAN, which adds to public discourse in this country, and the folks who work the cameras and make it happen.
Oh, thank you. It's really a great honor to be here and to have this wonderful audience, and I'm very grateful that you're all here at Politics and Prose. One of the really nice things about being able to speak about a new book is to go to real brick-and-mortar bookstores and to realize that there are still people that really like real books and come out for events like this because of the intellectual challenge and interest. So thank you all for coming. So I'm going to get straight into it. I wrote this book for a number of reasons. Samuel Huntington, the political scientist, was my teacher when I was a graduate student at Harvard. He wrote a very important book in 1968 called Political Order in Changing Societies, which I think, rereading it now in light of the Arab Spring, actually is probably one of the best guides to what is going on in the Middle East at the present moment. But it's a book that needed to be updated, and I thought of a project of doing a revision of this book. Among other things, it opens on the very first page. It says the Soviet Union and the United States are equally developed political orders, and that didn't seem quite right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the other major issue is the one that was just referred to. I've been thinking about nation building, failed states, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Haiti, all of these foreign policy challenges that we've faced. And we have this illusion, which I would call the problem of getting to Denmark. And Denmark is in quotation marks, because Denmark is actually not a real country. It's this mythical place that has low corruption, democracy, stable government, good services delivered very efficiently, and so forth. And we have this vision of Denmark in our back of our heads, and then we go to a place like Afghanistan and we say, well, how are we going to get Afghanistan to look like Denmark? And it doesn't work very well. And part of the reason I began to realize was that we don't understand how Denmark got to be Denmark. I actually have had a visiting professorship at Aarhus University in Denmark, so I've been going to Denmark for the last few years. And I'll tell you that most Danes actually have no idea how Denmark got to be Denmark. And so it struck me that as a political scientist, there ought to be a basic book you can go to say, where did political institutions come from? I didn't see one, and so I decided to write it. So that's why we get the book that I've produced. So I also did not want to write a book on the origins of politics that told this traditional Eurocentric or Anglo-centric story, not because I'm opposed to England or the West, but I think it's a distortion, and it's one that's been taught still in a lot of the discourse that really begins with Karl Marx, that sees England as the model for modernization. England's present is everybody's future. This is something actually that Karl Marx said. And what you realize when you actually learn something about the history of England is that it is a very peculiar country in a number of ways that I will explain to you. And to expect other countries to replicate England's modernization path, I think, is highly unrealistic. And in fact, in my view, it was China. China did not establish the first state. That happened in a lot of places, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Valley of Mexico. But in my view, the Chinese established the first modern state. Modern meaning not based on hiring your cousins and your friends to run the government, but based on civil service examinations, a rational bureaucracy, centralized administration. And they did this in the 3rd century BC. And it's a historical achievement that I think a lot of people have not adequately recognized. And so instead of starting with England or, Greece and Rome and then going through the Magna Carta and the rise of democracy in England, it seemed to me it made more sense to start with China. China created the first modern state. Why are other societies different from China? So that's the basic background. Now, there are 3 important baskets of political institutions that we need to think about. The first is the state itself. The state is all about power. The state is the ability to concentrate power in a hierarchy and to use it to enforce rules over a particular territory. All right? In the developing world, and this again is why I think we sometimes take politics for granted, we assume that things will happen. Like long term, I lived in Fairfax County for 20 years, and the potholes always get filled every spring. And why do those potholes get filled, but not in Papua New Guinea? Well, it turns out there's a hidden social structure that provides these services, and it does it pretty efficiently, at least in a rich county like Fairfax. Not so well in the district, but that's. But it's interesting, why those differences happen. And I think that all of the anti-government activists, of which there are many, especially in our society, don't understand that if you want a country that doesn't have a strong government that's able to enforce rules, you ought to move to Somalia or Afghanistan or, a less developed country that actually cannot enforce rules on its own territory. You know, Somalia, if you want to own not just an assault rifle but a RPG or a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapon, you're free to do it. But it's not a very happy society because it doesn't have institutions. All right, so that's the state. Second is the rule of law. The rule of law is all about community rules of justice that are regarded as superior to the will of whoever happens to be running the government, whether that is a president, a prime minister, a king, monarch, whatever. The executive in the society doesn't feel that he or she can just make up the rules on the fly, whatever they want, but they actually have to implement a law that someone else makes, all right? So that's the second set of important institutions. And then the third is institutions of accountability. Today we associate those with democracy, with elections. But that's not the only form of accountability. And in any event, when accountability institutions were first put into place in 17th century England, the king was accountable to Parliament that only represented 10% of the English population, the richest 10%. And so you can have accountability without having democracy. And I believe, as in China, you can also have moral accountability. That is to say, a government can feel obligated to take the interest of its citizens into account even in the absence of elections. So the question is, where do these come from? The state is all about the concentration of power. The rule of law and accountability are all means of limiting power. And the miracle of modern politics is that you get the President of the United States, who is the most powerful individual in human history. He can nuke the rest of the world if he wants to, but he doesn't because it's all limited by law and by accountable political institutions. It's a kind of miracle of modern politics, all right? So I'm going to tell you a few stories from the book in each of these baskets. Let's begin with the state. The state, in some sense, is, in my view, a big struggle against the family. Human nature tells you a couple of things. There's a universal human nature. And there are a couple of biological principles that govern human sociability. We sometimes get this incorrect notion from Thomas Hobbes that before the rise of the state you had just people clubbing each over the head, you know, in a anomic war of all against all, but that was actually never true. Human societies never went through that period. They were always social, and they're social because they're born with certain characteristics that allow them to cooperate. So one of them is a principle called kin selection or inclusive fitness by the biologists, which simply means you're going to be altruistic to people in proportion to the number of genes you share with them. In other words, nepotism. You're going to favor relatives. The second principle is reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours on a face-to-face basis. And no human child growing up anywhere has to be taught these mechanisms. These are inbuilt forms of sociability. They are the default ways that we relate to each other, friends and family. And in the absence of a modern institution that forces you to hire somebody with qualifications rather than your cousin or your brother-in-law, that's the way you're going to do it. That's the kind of normal politics that will insert itself. And so in a sense, the states arose in societies that were organized tribally, meaning people were in large kin groups. They all believe that they're descended from a common ancestor, that they're basically third and fourth and fifth cousins. And how do you get from a state that is based on kinship as a form of social organization to one that's based on citizenship, in which it's not a matter of who you're related to, it's the fact that I'm a citizen of the state of France or Japan or whatever. And so that's why there's a struggle, constant struggle against especially this biological urge to protect your children. Now, how did this happen? In China, it unfortunately happened as a result of centuries-long military conflict. There's a famous political scientist, Charles Tilly, who was famous for arguing in the case of Europe that the state makes war and war makes the state, that it's really military competition that drove people out of tribal societies into these more organized hierarchical units. And if you look at Chinese history, that is exactly the story that unfolds. So at the beginning of the Western Zhou dynasty in about 1100 BC, these tribes come in from Manchuria. They conquer the Shang peoples. At that point, they're split up into maybe 3,000 tribal groups. In the spring and autumn period, they fight about 1,200 wars with one another. In the Warring States period, they fight about 450 wars. The number is reduced only because so many states have been snuffed out and conquered at this point that there just aren't as many states to fight these wars. And finally, this process winnows down. There's 7 surviving states in the Warring States period. And finally, in the year 221 BC, the state of Qin, this powerful Western state, manages to conquer all of its rivals, and it establishes the first unified Chinese dynasty. And as in Europe, another 1,800 years later, this process is driven by the needs of warfare. First, you're fighting with aristocrats riding chariots, but they find out that if you conscript peasants and create an infantry army, you'll do a lot better. But in order to conscript the peasants, you need to tax, you need resources, so that requires that you do cadastral surveys, you create a bureaucracy in order to tax, and you need an administrative hierarchy to run this whole machine. And this is what the Chinese do, and they figure out that if you hire, again, your cousin to be a general, as Lincoln, did all these patronage appointments early on in the Civil War, you're going to lose the war, right? And so you need a different principle. You need an impersonal, merit-based principle, and this is what the Chinese did. They're the first ones to come up with a civil service examination as a means of entry into the government, and as I said, they did this in the 3rd century BC. Now, unfortunately, it didn't last. The great Han dynasty that really defines Chinese civilization saw the flourishing of centralized, high-quality government. It falls apart in the 3rd century AD for a number of reasons, and what happens? It's repatrimonialized, meaning that aristocratic families, people with wealth and power, recapture the government. And this continues really through the Sui and Tang dynasties, and this modern Chinese state that had been established already in the 3rd century doesn't get put back into place really until about 1100 or so in the northern Song period. And so the struggle against the family goes on for a very long time. Now, the weirdest institution designed to create a powerful state and to beat back the family is the system of military slavery that developed during the Abbasid dynasty, the second big Arab dynasty, and was carried to its logical conclusion by the Ottomans. What the Ottomans did every 3 or 4 years is they'd send out a group of people into the Balkan provinces of the empire. Like football scouts, they would look for young men between the ages of 12 and 19. They would forcibly take them from their families, and they'd raise them as slaves in the palace in Topkapi or in Edirne. But they would train them not for lives of degradation, but to be senior military officers and administrators, and indeed the Grand Vizier, who is in effect the Prime Minister of the Ottoman Empire. Now, why did they create this strange institution? And by the way, the people recruited in this fashion were not allowed to marry, and they were not allowed to have children. If they did have children, they were either expelled from the Janissary Corps or from the Corps of Sipahis, and their children were never allowed to rise to positions of status. Why did they do it? It's, again, all because of the family. The moment that you allow people in elite positions to have children, what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to secure positions for their children. And the Ottomans understood that a modern administration has to be based on promoting people by merit, and therefore, if you allow them to have families, you wouldn't be able to do this. So they created, in effect, a one-generation aristocracy. And the whole Ottoman system began to collapse the moment these entrenched groups took the opening caused by famine and rising inflation in the 17th century to start to demand that their children be allowed to assume their positions. This is a general problem in France, old regime France, before the French Revolution. They faced exactly the same problem. Wealthy elites that potentially could oppose the king. So what do they do? What does the French monarchy do? They sell offices. They sell the office of tax collector or finance minister to wealthy individuals. This actually had an important impact in breaking up the opposition to this centralization product of Louis XIV and these other great monarchs. But again, this desire to turn public, first of all, there's a desire to privatize public office. You want to grab as much of the public sector as you can. And then in the early 1600s, under an institution called the Paulette, it became permissible for these wealthy individuals that had bought public offices to actually turn them over to their children as heritable property. So along with the chateau and all the nice vineyards and everything, you'd also get, the position of Trésorier de France or some other public office. And so by the time of the Revolution, the entire French public sector had essentially been sold off to wealthy individuals. Again, this constant struggle, you can't create a modern state under these circumstances. And so one of the things that the Revolution did was basically divested all of these old elites of not just their property and offices, but their heads in a lot of cases. And, it took a violent revolution to eliminate that system. Now, let's talk about the rule of law. So this is a second really important basket of institutions. And as I said, the rule of law are limitations. They're rules that limit the discretion of rulers to do as they want. So where does this come from? Where do you ever get this kind of system? And in my view, historically, it's always come out of religion. Because if you think about it, religion is the only source of rules that is outside of politics, where rulers are actually limited by rules that they themselves don't make. And this is true in many civilizational conditions. It's true of ancient Israel. It is true in the Christian tradition. It is true in the world of Islam. And it is true in India under Hinduism. In every one of these societies, you have a religious law that is made by religious authorities, interpreted by hierarchies of religious judges, the ulama or scholars in the case of Islam, the Brahmins, the priestly class in the case of India. And in all of these cases, the ruler actually has to go to the religious authority to get sanctioned. So in India, to become a Raja, you have to be sanctified by a Brahmin. There's a clear status distinction, and it's the priest that is on top of the warrior in that society. And so that's rule of law. I mean, that's what we mean by rule of law. The only world civilization that did not have rule of law in this sense is China. And the reason I believe that the Chinese never had this kind of rule of law was they never had a transcendental religion. They had ancestor worship, but actually, it's amazing that the Chinese got to be so sophisticated with such a primitive religion, because ancestor worship, you're not required to worship the emperor's ancestors. You only have to worship your ancestors. And so there's really no kind of authority that comes from it. And it was completely controlled by the state. And so no Chinese emperor has ever felt that there's a higher source of law that they have to obey, and that continues to the present day. The Chinese Communist Party does not, they've got a constitution, but they make the constitution. The constitution doesn't really limit what they want to do. Now, in the West, the rule of law develops very early and very powerfully. One of the heroes in my book, the classic modernization theory, all like the Reformation. I like the Catholic Church in a couple of important historical respects. In terms of the rule of law, the Church was extremely important. In the post-Carolingian period, in the early Middle Ages, bishops and priests could marry, and they could have children. And guess what they did? They all sought to turn their benefices over to their children. They got involved in court politics. They were all wrapped up in the clan shenanigans of all the local princes in Italy and Germany. And you had at one point in the late 11th century, the rise of a Pope, Gregory VII, who was a titanic historical figure. He was very much like Martin Luther, who would come after him by a few centuries, who realized that unless the Church itself eliminated this biological principle of being able to have children, it would not have the moral authority to become an independent institution. Furthermore, at that point, all of the bishops in the Church were being appointed by the emperor, so the Church did not have control over its own personnel policy, basically. All right, so he declares that the Church is independent. They're going to appoint the bishops, and all of the priests and bishops have to be celibate. They cannot marry, they cannot have children. This, of course, comes as something of a surprise to all of these married priests. They don't like it. It's a huge struggle within the Church, and it's an even bigger struggle with the emperor, because the emperor wants to keep the Church as his, legitimating a source of authority. They fight a two-generation war, the allies of the Pope versus the allies of the Emperor. And at the end of this period, the Church achieves independence. And at that point, they can establish a separate ecclesiastical law presided over by bishops and priests appointed only by the church. The first lawyers are all ecclesiastical lawyers. The whole idea of bureaucratic government by legal specialists is really a creation that happens first in the church and then gets transferred to the secular realm. And it also, in the Christian West, divides church and state at this very early point, and the legal authorities have legitimacy and a separate hierarchy that is completely independent of European rulers. And this is extremely important for subsequent European development, because any European ruler that wants to be like a Chinese emperor and just do whatever the hell he pleases has to contend with the fact that there's a pre-existing set of legal constraints that prevent him or her from doing that. All right, the final basket of institutions are institutions of accountability, aka democracy. So you sometimes get the idea, and I think this actually comes from Tocqueville, that once the idea of equality gets out, it's just unstoppable, and it just, happens. But I think one of the things that you realize when you look at the actual history of the rise of democracy is just how weird and, in a way, contingent its emergence was. And it arose really because of the survival of a peculiar feudal institution into modern times, which was called the Parliament. Every European country in the Middle Ages had a body called an estate, a parliament, a sovereign court. In Spain, there were the Cortes. In Russia, there were the Ziemski Sobor. In Poland and Hungary, they were the Diets. All of these were collections of notables, of gentry, of high nobility, sometimes of the bourgeoisie, and the king traditionally had to go to these bodies to get permission to wage war and especially to collect taxes, all right? In the late 16th and 17th centuries, you had all of these powerful monarchs that wanted to behave like a Chinese emperor. They wanted to create a centralized, powerful, bureaucratic realm in which everything was uniform. And they waged this long struggle against these estates in every single country. And only in one of them did the parliament or the estates win that battle, and that was England. And, in a sense, it shows you how accidental history is. It didn't. Parliament didn't prevail in France. It didn't, and it didn't prevail, by the way, because the French had sold off all of these offices to wealthy individuals. And so, once they took care of, you take care of me and my family, I'm fine with everything else. We're not going to defend our liberties. And so, as Tocqueville said, the French interpreted liberty as privilege. But it didn't happen in Spain. It certainly didn't happen in Russia, where the Tsar basically recruited the entire nobility into his own military organization. It did happen in England for very peculiar reasons, because Parliament, for a whole variety of reasons, had a lot of solidarity. They hung together. Not only did they hang together, they raised an army. They fought a civil war with the king. They defeated him. They cut off his head. This was Charles the First in the 1640s. And then in 1688, they deposed another king, James II, and brought in William of Orange from Holland to be their new monarch because of this whole issue that they did not want to be taxed without parliamentary consent. All right. So it just happens that in this one island nation, you get this powerful parliament that is able to force a constitutional settlement on the English monarch. From there to the American founding is a really short distance, because John Locke was a participant in the events of the Glorious Revolution. He wrote, the second treatise on government, justifying rule as something that has to come out of consent of the governed. And then you get to the American Revolution, which is based on the principle no taxation without representation. And so the distance from those English events during the English Civil War and our own founding as a country based on democratic consent is really not a long distance at all. But it wouldn't have happened if, we had been colonized by Spain, and indeed in Latin America it didn't happen on that time scale, and it didn't result in a powerful commercial empire the way England evolved, except for this balancing of rule of law, accountable government, and a strong state. All right, so this is the miracle. This is how this miracle happened. But if you think about it, there was no necessity. There's no historical driving forces that dictated that this would be the outcome. Once England got there, it was a very powerful model, and other people wanted to imitate it. But the fact that they got there in the first place was a kind of historical accident. In China, because the state had been so powerful at such an early stage in their history, they never allowed free cities or a bourgeoisie or a blood aristocracy or opposing religious groups to appear, and they don't do it to this day. They control Falun Gong because it is a potential source of opposition to the regime. So let me just conclude with a couple of observations about how this is relevant to understanding politics in the modern world. So let's begin with India and China. So every business school for the last 10, 15 years has been doing these emerging markets courses contrasting India and China. When China wants to build the Three Gorges Dam, they have to move 1.2 million people out of the floodplain. They just do it, They say, we're going to do it. People kick and scream, and there's a lot of unhappiness, but they do it. All the people are moved out. They build the dam. High-speed rail, these beautiful airports in Chinese cities, turnpikes, infrastructure, right? Because they have this very strong and relatively high-quality authoritarian government that does not need to respect, the interests of citizens. In India, just to give you one example, the Tata Motor Company a couple of years ago wanted to establish a car assembly plant in West Bengal. So what happens? They get hit with lawsuits, peasants associations, trade unions. They all go on strike protesting the siting of this plant there. And finally say, okay, enough. We're not going to do it, and they put the plant elsewhere. And so in India, you've got a real problem with basic infrastructure because they're a divided, law-governed democracy. There are checks and balances. The Indian state can't do anything at once because it's evolved in this fashion where law and accountability are actually much more important. Now, a lot of people will say, well, this is the inheritance of British colonialism or something that happened in the last couple hundred years of the history of these countries. And I think, having written this book, I now understand that this is total nonsense, that these reflect patterns of government that are at least 2,500 years old. Since the unification of China in 221 BC, the country has fallen apart in interdynastic periods, but it always has come together. And it spent more time as a unified, authoritarian country governed by a single authority than it has in a state of disunity. India is almost the mirror opposite. It's only been unified for two brief periods, under the Mauryan Empire of Ashoka and then under the Guptas a few centuries later. When the Mughals or the British invaded and sought to rule India, none of them were able to extend their rule through the whole of the subcontinent. So the fact that India is a democracy, I don't believe has deep historical roots, but the fact that it's not a Chinese-style dictatorship is absolutely not accidental. Nobody in Indian history has ever been able to rule India in that kind of authoritarian fashion because Indian society is way too tough. It's organized into castes and village associations and very powerful religious groups, all of which have resisted any political effort to to dominate. All right. The final thing I mentioned that I think that the Eurocentric accounts of modernization don't understand how peculiar European modernization is, and I think that that's important to remember when we try to modernize, through development assistance, countries in the third world today. How is European development peculiar? Well, first of all, the exit from kinship was again not done by a state, by a powerful state that demanded that people have allegiance to it. It was done by the Catholic Church. The Church at the end of the Roman Empire, set rules of inheritance. They forbade concubines, they forbade divorce, they forbade marriage up to 5 degrees of relatedness, of cousins. And all of these were means of cutting off the ability of clans, of tribal groups, to keep property within the clan. And they also supported the right of women to hold and alienate property at this very, very early stage in the Middle Ages. And they did this for self-interested reasons, not doctrinally, but because they wanted to break the economic power of these tribal groups, and it worked beautifully. It turns out that a lot of widows and spinsters in this period ended up with all the money in the family, and when they died without children, guess who inherited all that money? It was the Catholic Church. So churches' holdings in France go up by 20–30% in the first part of the 8th century as a result of these changes in the rules, and it means that individualism started in Europe at a much, much earlier point. It wasn't the product of the Industrial Revolution or the Reformation or anything like this. Within 2 or 3 generations of their conversion to Christianity, all these barbarian tribes were already no longer living in these tribal associations. And in England, it gets carried to this extreme where if you were a parent who was improvident enough to turn over your fortune to your son before you died without having signed a maintenance contract, you could be in big trouble, because the kid could just say, well, sorry, Dad, I got my own business to worry about, and I'll try to take care of you, but it's not a priority. And so in English families, already in the 1300s, you're having families sign contracts with each other because you could not rely on children to take care of their children in their parents in old age. So already that presumes a huge amount of individualism. That we're not bound by what Ernest Gellner called the tyranny of cousins, in which everything is within this big agglomeration of relatives. We're much more individualistic early on, and then finally, the sequence of development in Europe goes like this. It goes first rule of law, then you construct a powerful centralized state, and only later do you get democratic accountability. But law comes before the state building. The early modern European monarchs that wanted to create Chinese-style states had to do this against the background of existing laws that limited their ability to exercise power. Final anecdote I'll leave you with is my favorite historical character that's recounted in this book was the evil Empress Wu. The evil Empress Wu was the only woman in Chinese history who ever established a dynasty in her own name, as opposed to ruling as a regent through her son or husband. She came early in the Tang dynasty in the 6th century. She was originally a concubine of the second Tang emperor. She got into his graces, and she displaced the existing empress by having her own daughter have an audience with the empress, and then was smothered. And the death was blamed on the empress, and the emperor got rid of her and made Madame Wu the new empress. She actually killed a couple of her own sons in her rise to power, and she managed to kill off a great part of the Tang nobility that stood in the way of her rise to power. It didn't do much for women's empowerment, unfortunately, in China. There's actually a plaque somewhere in the Forbidden City that warns against women in politics after the experience of the evil Empress Wu. Now, the reason I tell this story is you contrast that to a couple of stories from Europe. You had a couple of big revolts. In the 1520s, there was this thing called the Comunero Revolt against the great Habsburg Emperor Charles V. They fought a civil war, in essence, for a few years, and the emperor won, defeated his enemies. There was a similar war, civil war, called the Fronde in France 130 years later under Louis XIV. And again, they fought a very bloody civil war, and the king defeated his aristocratic foes. In both of those cases, it's very remarkable that Charles V and Louis XIV basically pardon their noble opponents, and they go back to their estates and live happily ever after. If this had been China, the emperor would have killed those aristocratic opponents, and they killed off every member of the lineage of those opponents to make sure that the rope of descent was broken. And so I do think that the early presence of law in European development really did make some difference in terms of the kind of authoritarian government you could actually create. Of course, until these horrible governments, totalitarian governments of the 20th century, where as a result of modernization you undermine all of the authority of these traditional forms of law. So this is the book. Well, it's not the book. It's a small part of the book, but I guess what I've learned in the 20 years since the end of history is that, the whole process by which we get to modern liberal democracy, which I do believe is really the only realistic alternative for modern society, was actually based on an awful lot of accident and, in a sense, good luck. And it means that if we try to create similar institutions in other societies that haven't had similar experiences, it's a hard process. Right? Thank you very much.
What a rich presentation. Maybe nominally a political scientist, but lots of historic sensibility. And one of the things you ought to know is that Francis Fukuyama has been in public service. He's been one of those who's tried to let government have a longer range outlook than governments have by serving on the State Department policy planning staff twice and as the deputy under Dennis Ross. And as you know, there's been a distinguished group of people who have served as head of the State Department policy planning staff: George Kennan, Sam Lewis, Winston Lord, Robert Bowie, Dennis Ross, people who have a passion for public service, as does Francis Fukuyama. So let's begin with the questions.
That was a wonderful overview, and maybe this question is too specific and not general enough. But you began by saying, how do we get to be Denmark? And there's now a divide opening between England and us and Europe. Their vision of the state involves a lot more state responsibility to take care of retirement, to organize health, and we seem to be going in exactly the other direction. Mm-hmm. Is there something in your theory that kind of speaks to that?
You got to wait for volume 2 for that one. Right? but it's a very good question, and it is a volume 2 kind of issue. But most of what I know about this subject I learned from Seymour Martin Lipset, the great sociologist and political scientist, who wrote a very excellent book called American Exceptionalism, which is a book about why the United States is so peculiar when you compare it to other developed countries. And one of the important ways it's different is we don't trust government. We just don't trust government. In Europe, people see the government as the embodiment of the public interest. It's something you look up to and you respect because it represents the public interest. In the United States, it's always been regarded as something that potentially is oppressive, and Lipset argued that came out of the American Revolution, basically, because the U.S. was born in a revolt against overweening monarchical power, and that's in a way stuck with us. And so, and then I think the other issue is that since America was a land of new settlement for Europeans, obviously not for the indigenous people that happen to be living here, but for the new settlers, it always had a much greater degree of social mobility, so that you could arrive, and at least if you didn't make it, your children, your grandchildren could rise in economic status. And that, I think, reinforced this American view that if you're poor, it's because you haven't worked hard enough, and if you're rich, it's because you're industrious and thrifty, and there's enough truth to that I think it reinforced this American kind of unwillingness to have the state put you ahead. It ought to be individuals doing this on their own.
Yeah. Francis, I have a question since our State Department days where we used to talk about democratization as the process. But there's one element that you haven't brought up, and that's the issue of technology and the spread of information. And I suspect that's going to be in your second volume. But I wonder if you could speak to that briefly, because it seems to me that we may be at that end of history moment where information technology has radically changed a lot of the underlying theories of some of these arguments, I think.
Well, I think that there's been this important change with social media, for example. So it played obviously a very big role in the Arab Spring. It's very good at mobilizing people, and social mobilization is really critical for producing democratic change. What's not clear to me is whether it's as good in producing institutions down the road as it is in this kind of short-term mobilization. If you look at Tunisia or Egypt right now, what they desperately need is not more social mobilization. They need political parties, leaders, free media, all of these institutions that make civil society powerful and able to stand up and demand things of the government. Technology can help with that. It certainly can help with that. But I think that it's not kind of the panacea that some people see it as being.
Yeah, I was referring to it more in the sense of transcending the other inherent problems, that the information can overcome some of these things that we didn't have before. That was more the nature of my point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, for the second volume, you might want to check some other authority than Marty Lipset. Since the end of the Second World War, the rates of intergenerational social mobility in parts of Western Europe have been demonstrably higher than ours, presumably because of the welfare state and educational investment. But I've got a question.
Lipset did not assert factually that mobility was higher, but he said that Americans believe that it's higher.
Yes. I have a question which represents a professional or professorial defamation. You think in big terms. You're one of the social scientists who do. Every campus has one, for better or for worse. Some have 2, 3, 4. And yet this city is full of tens of thousands of university graduates, highly educated in the federal bureaucracy, even in the armed services. General Petraeus is extremely proud of his Princeton PhD. And yet, if you look at the results in terms of policy derivatives of what we think they might have learned in our universities, the results are, let us say, far from sublime. What's your comment?
Well, as a professional educator, I don't want to denigrate the impact of university educations. I mean, I taught at SAIS for a decade, and I think that, I think some of my students are here as we speak. Did you learn anything? Yeah, okay, so see, however, okay, so let me make this comment. I actually think that the direction that a lot of the social sciences have moved in the last 20 years has not been helpful, because it's basically been taken over by economics. And so actually one of my agendas in writing this book that's full of history is to remind people that they can't understand the way the contemporary world is unless they know more history. You can't do things by game theoretic models and regressions alone. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of contemporary American political science has actually not been terribly useful to policymakers is because it's now moved into this abstract realm where people don't know about real places, and therefore they can't tell you well, what do you do in Pashtunistan when you're confronting these tribes, because nobody's bothered to learn the languages or to spend time in the villages and actually figure out what's going on there. So I'll grant you that much. But of course, my students spend time in these villages, and they are big exceptions to to this general rule.
Yeah, my students, not to mention my Harvard colleagues, like fellow students like Henry Kissinger, were simply awful. But so congratulations.
That was Norman Birnbaum, who's a distinguished professor at Georgetown and who has written many fascinating books and has presented here as well.
Hi. In The End of History and The Last Man, you argue that liberal democracy represents the end point of history, capital H history, which is to say that, unlike previous stages of history, it does not contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction. It does not have those internal contradictions that have destroyed all others. Mm-hmm. In the first chapter of your new book, you touch on some disturbing themes in our culture, the notion amongst a lot of people that government is simply bad and not needed, stratification of wealth, the rise of corporations. In the 20 years since you published The End of History, have you had reason to doubt that we are in fact at the end of history, or do you think we might be seeing the destruction of what we thought was the end of history to spawn something new?
Well, there's a couple of different parts of the answer to that. So I have been thinking a lot in the last 20 years. I haven't stood still. And one of the important themes in the current book is one that I pick up from Huntington's, which is the possibility of political decay. Because one thing you see very clearly is that you create institutions for one set of purposes, and then people invest them with a kind of intrinsic worth, either through religious sanctification or historical tradition or whatever, and then the circumstances change and the institutions need to be changed and they become dysfunctional. Now, I would say we've got a problem right now in the United States because we face certain long-term challenges, fiscal sustainability of, where we are and so forth. And our political system is so checked and balanced that it's so polarized, the underlying political culture is so polarized that we can't make these basic decisions. And if indeed we cannot solve these problems, there's no reason to think that our particular American democracy is going to do all that well, and it could certainly, decay over time. Now, that's a slightly different question from the one I raised in The End of History, which is, okay, in theory, can you think of a better political system that would solve these problems? And right now, I think the one that's out there is this authoritarian, capitalist China. And for a number of reasons, I think they're on a roll right now. But I don't actually believe that system is sustainable over a long period of time compared to a system like ours that has checks and balances, largely because I don't think the Chinese have ever solved this problem that they themselves call the bad emperor problem, which is to say that if you have an authoritarian system without checks and balances and you've got a good emperor, you're sitting pretty. You can make quick decisions much faster than a democracy that has to get consensus and agreement and so forth with interest groups and that sort of thing. But if you got a bad emperor, you're in really big trouble because there's no way of getting rid of that person. The evil Empress Wu, or the first Qin emperor, was a megalomaniacal, guy that buried 400 Confucian scholars in an open pit because he didn't like, what they were saying about him. You get these, and Mao Zedong was really the last bad emperor, I think, that most Chinese would acknowledge. You don't get that in a democratic system because we do have checks and balances. So in that respect, I still vote with our system down the road for all of its current problems.
Great. Thanks very much.
You dated the importance of the law in the church to the 8th century.
No, that was the end of the family. The investiture crisis happens in the 10th century, or the 11th century, rather.
Ah, okay. That shoots the question, because I was wondering, because we've always been told that Charlemagne saved civilization, and if it had already had the foundation of the laws in the 8th century, he would have been the inherited.
No.
He did not have that.
No.
Okay, misunderstood you.
Okay.
Congratulations on the book and your success. I wanted to ask you, as somebody who believes that you made very correct predictions a year before the end of communism in Eastern Europe, and also even the end of history. My belief is Tiananmen had fallen, and the two persons before me pretty much asked the question, but I want to kind of emphasize a little more. Obviously, we don't want war, we don't want chaos, we cannot have democracy and free markets in the Arab world, in Iran and China all at the same time. That's obvious. But is it something that you would recommend to policymakers right now in the United States, although they have to deal with a lot here in the United States? Should we be not afraid of saying we want democracy and free markets to prevail, obviously, without chaos, without wars, and so forth?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I believe that historically the United States has always regarded it as part of its national identity, virtually, to be not just, we happen to be democratic here in North America, but, we're kind of a model to other people. We believe that this is, based in universal, human rights and rules of justice, and we have, we've promoted democracy in all over the place. My objection during the Iraq War was we shouldn't do it militarily. I mean, it ought to be based on people in these societies that want democracy, and there's plenty of ways that we can level up the playing field when they're facing very repressive authoritarian regimes. So the means was different, and also I've never believed that American democracy per se was the model for democracy as such. In many ways, the European Union represents a more accurate version of what the end of history would look like, because they actually want to transcend power politics and replace power by rules and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. Quick question. How does India's policy in Kashmir fit in with its image of a democracy? Like 75,000 deaths unaccounted, unsung for in the past 2 decades.
I'm not going to act as a spokesman for the Indian government. I don't know why they're doing this in Kashmir. I mean, democracies do a lot of dumb things. I think you look at American foreign policy and you see that, we make a lot of mistakes in the world as well. The other thing is that just because a country is a democracy doesn't mean that it puts the promotion of democratic values first and foremost, in all aspects of its policy. We support Saudi Arabia because they got oil, not because they're a democracy. That's just a fact of life. I think, and it's interesting, actually, that a lot of newer democracies like India, Turkey, Brazil are also different from the United States because they actually don't regard the projection of democratic values around the world, with the same as the same imperative that Americans do. And it's interesting, why that's the case.
We're going to take everyone who's in line for the questions, and then we'll have to come to an end. So everyone who's in line gets to ask.
I think this is a volume 3 question. Given the supranational organizations, UN, World Trade Organization, the World Court, and a whole bunch of regional organizations, can I coax you into commenting on the prospects of a world state?
Oh, sure. I think the prospect is zero. No, I just think that if you look at a political system, it has to be based on some minimal degree of consensus about basic rules of justice, of values, and so forth. And in a big, diverse democracy like the United States, we're having a lot of trouble with that. In rural Louisiana, people think really differently from San Francisco, where close to where I live, and so it's hard enough to manage that within an American context, but you start talking about the diversity of, levels of development and cultures and everything else that exists in the world. I think it's not a reasonable prospect. This is something I actually wrote about in my last book, America at the Crossroads. What I do think you can hope for is a much denser system of partial organizations that overlap, and some are regional and some are functional, and they provide global governance, but not through a single world government.
This question may sound a little Eurocentric, and I apologize ahead of time, but I think at the end of the Middle Ages, with the Treaty of Westphalia, we sort of established between nation states an agreement that the sovereignty of the nation state was the number one sort of legal issue in relations between states, and I think that sort of governed, at least in theory, the relations between states. It seems until very recently. Do you think that in the post-World War II order, the idea that the responsibility to protect often trumps the right to sovereignty for a state, which seems to be accelerating in the post-Cold War order, especially with Russia justifying its intervention in Georgia by sort of normative example of the West intervening in Kosovo? Do you think that we're moving into a post-Westphalian system between nation states?
Yeah, I don't think we were ever that deeply into a Westphalian system. I mean, in the 19th century, you may have had that just in Europe, but you think about the 20th century, you have all these Marxists, Leninists running around trying to undermine other states, in the name of a communist revolution. You have the United States, trying to do the same thing except in an anti-communist direction. And so I don't, in the 20th century, I don't think anyone's respected sovereignty terribly well. And I don't, as a ethical matter, I think that there's an important argument that you can make that if you really believe in a Westphalian system, it produces a certain moderation in international relations, because it means that you're not going to try to get involved in the internal politics of your neighbors and destabilize them and this sort of thing. But unfortunately, I just don't think we live in that kind of world. Globalization means ideas, people, influences are just traveling across borders all the time, and this idea that we can hermetically seal countries off and say we're not touching them, I don't think is realistic.
Thank you.
Hi, I took your class back in 1999. Hi. So I read the book. I think I wrote him an email, but he didn't get back to me. I read the book, and I'm, as is my wont, and perhaps the essay that you wrote about plutocracy sort of added to this, but I read it sort of as a grand refutation, a very, very historically referenced refutation of libertarian ideology, what with the continued emphasis on how institutional decay or civilizations kind of, live and die on their ability to tax. Interestingly, which you don't mention, I think that was like Putin's whole. I think that was like one of Putin's big
they rise or fall
innovations.
in their ability to tax legitimately.
Yeah, legitimately, yes. As opposed to the current system that we have right now. So I was wondering about that, and also generally, since you no longer live in D.C., has that changed your opinions about things?
Well, it's made me much more comfortable in the summer, I would say. No, but I think the issue of taxation is really important, because I think that it is, a hallmark of a serious government that it is able to legitimately tax, and that people are willing to pay taxes in order to support public services. And so I think one of the unfortunate elements that was thrown into our ideological mix, as a result of Reaganism, was this view that, in some quarters, that basically all taxation is illegitimate, or that you can never, under any circumstances, raise taxes and so forth. Because I don't think you're ever going to have a serious country if that's your starting assumption. So I am not. Yes, you're right. I am not a libertarian. And I will talk to you, but it's just I've been busy. So.
Hi, Frank. You described tribal society as a precursor to the state. What relevance does that bear to a country like Libya, where tribes are still tremendously important, although they have a state?
Well, so it turns out that we've discovered, to our dismay, that there are still many societies in the Middle East that are organized tribally. When we stumbled into Anbar province, we simply didn't realize, that you had to go to the sheikh and get him to agree on behalf of the tribe, rather than, trying to organize elections and, all this other stuff that Americans are wont to do. And I think one of the big Tunisia and Egypt have had national identities and much more modern political systems than, let's say, Yemen or Libya or even Jordan, in which tribalism is still extremely strong. And one of the things we simply do not know about Libya is the degree to which the current conflict, represents authoritarianism versus democracy, or whether it is a fight between Gaddafi's tribe and another tribe. And that's one of the big dangers that we, risked when we got involved. I mean, I still think we had to do it because I think if he had been able to crush Benghazi, it just would have been terrible. But that being said, we just don't know a lot about that society and how it's actually organized.
Thank you.
Can my friend Jonathan Pollock ask? He actually had his hand up.
Come to the mic so that everyone can hear you. Please come to the mic because this is on C-SPAN.
No, you have to
come to the mic.
I'll take orders.
Don't have trouble with authority.
Thank you. Frank, you alluded to Charles Tilly, and I understand and agree with much of what you say about that. But what you haven't alluded to, and I'm not offering another generalization that you have to venture into, is how does the phenomenon of war, and interstate war in particular, affect the evolution of systems as you see it, or is that something you...
Well, no, so it drives state building, but it doesn't cease to drive state building after you get a state. It continues. Like, you look at this city. There's this big five-sided building sitting next to the Potomac River. Where did that come from? Where did the growth of the big federal government, before the Civil War, the population of this city was, I don't know, something like 50,000 people. It was a tiny thing. And then all of a sudden, after the Civil War, it's several 100,000. And all because, the needs of war drove, the increases in the need for civilian bureaucracies of various sorts. So I think that is a process that continues to operate. One of the unfortunate things is that a lot of times reform can only be brought about by military threat and competition, because people are kind of mule-headed, and a lot of times they're stuck in certain ways, and unless they're really hit on the head by a 2x4, meaning by the threat of real military danger, they're just not going to, do the things that are necessary. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
This event was hosted by Politics and Prose Bookstore here in Washington, D.C. To find out more, visit politics-prose.com.